Okay. Hello, testing. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Just going to quiet down for a quick second. We're going to start the event tonight. Just because there is many people in attendance, I want to let everybody know that there is, in addition to the exit in the back, there is an emergency exit over here to the right. Just letting everybody know. Okay. You can't hear me? Can everybody hear me? Is this better? Okay. All right. Hello and welcome. My name is Danny. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose bookstore, where we host a range of in-store events along with classes and trips. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to please silence your cell phones so as not to disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion, I ask that you please ask questions, not make statements, and come up here to the left where the microphone is. If you guys in the back cannot see, the microphone is up here to my left next to this pole. All right. For tonight's event, we're partnered with Jewish Currents, a magazine founded in 1946 that is committed to the rich tradition of thought, activism, and culture on the Jewish left and the left more broadly. Tonight, please welcome me in joining Peter Beinart to talk about his book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza. A Reckoning. In Beinart's view, one story dominates Jewish communal life, that of persecution and victimhood. It is a story that erases much of the nuance of Jewish religious tradition and warps our understanding of Israel and Palestine. His book provides a provocative argument that will expand and inform one of the defining conversations of our time. Beinart is a professor of journalism and political science at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at the City University of New York. He's also an editor-at-large of Jewish Currents, a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, an MSNBC political commentator, and a non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He writes also in the Beinart Notebook newsletter on Substack. Tonight, Beinart will be in conversation with Karen Attiah, a journalist and columnist for The Washington Post, known for her insightful work on race, gender, human rights, and international affairs. In 2016, she became The Washington Post's founding global opinions editor and commissioning op-eds on global issues, and was named an opinions columnist in 2021. So please please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Peter Beinart and Karen Attiah.
Wow, this is a packed house. You're a rock star, you know?
I don't know. I thought people had more going on.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Politics and Prose, for having me, and thank you, Peter, for having me. I'm going to be the enforcer in the room as far as the house rules. We will have an opportunity for a Q&A at the end, so about 20 minutes. And there is a microphone here, right by this column right here. Any and all questions that I will take will only be from that microphone. No shouting from the crowd, please. And let's all try to keep this civil, respectful, and informative, right? All right, sounds good. Y'all ready? All right, let's go. So for those of you who haven't read Peter's book, this has been the first book in a long time, and I'm just saying that because I know you. And I'm not just saying that, but this book hit me at a very deep soul human level. Your willingness to grapple with a lot of these questions, to grapple with the stories that you grew up with. So I'm really honored that you decided to speak with me about this and that you decided to write it. To preface all of this, I want to go to what happened when you posted that you and I were going to be in conversation today. Someone said, when are you going to sit down with someone who doesn't hate Israel to test your thesis outside of a laboratory experiment, Peter? Your book is supposedly about being Jewish. Shouldn't you be speaking with people who are Jewish about your thoughts? Someone else said, sounds like you'll be in your safe space, Peter. I know anti-Zionist non-Jews love you. You make an excellent token. So I frame all this to say, I am actually very curious about why you decided to write this book, who the audience is for this book, and yeah, sure, why me? Why us?
Well, I mean, why you, Karen? Because I know that you are someone who has grappled a great deal with your own Christian faith, and someone who it's deep within you, and yet you've found that you've had to level some really painful criticisms at the tradition that you grew up with. So that's part of it. I also see you as one of the people who I believe can change this conversation. Although my book was written in a way for Jews, kind of in a strange, maybe paradoxical way, I feel like in some ways the work that I hope that we can do as Jews to change our internal conversation, to me, is critically important to opening up the American conversation about Israel so that charges of anti-Semitism don't silence good people like you who can bring your perspective about other struggles for liberation to this struggle for liberation. In terms of speaking to Jews, I mean, I would just say to those folks at Twitter, you know, if on X or whatever, if any of their synagogues are interested in hosting me, I would be more than happy. To be honest, one of the most, the hardest things about this experience of writing this book is how difficult it is for me to speak in synagogues. You know, the same kind of synagogues in which I pray are really not places that are genuinely open for me to make this critique. And I would say to those folks, you know, if you're confident in your defenses of what Israel has done in Gaza and of the nature of the state, then you really have nothing to fear from these conversations. And if you say, as many Jewish institutions do, that we pride ourselves on the kind of fierce, no-holds-barred nature of the tradition that we take from Talmudic discourse, then this should be an opportunity to have that kind of discourse in today's time. So if you are one of those people who came tonight who really strongly disagrees with me, I wanted to just say thank you. I'm deeply grateful that you're here. The book is really written to the people in my life who I love, who profoundly disagree with me, because I felt so inadequate in my ability to say things to them over the last 15 months that I felt like I had to go off and write a book about it. And in general, I really admire people who come and expose themselves to different points of view. It says in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, who is wise? The one who learns from all people. So I always feel like if there's someone in the audience who is the most ideologically distant from me, in some ways they are showing the greatest degree of wisdom by willing to listen to someone they disagree with. So, but I would also say to those people, you don't have to come to me. I will come to you. I will very, very happily come to your spaces and make these arguments because they're made, although people may not believe it, they're made from a position of love and solidarity for the Jewish people because I care about our people and I think we've gone very, very badly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, you begin the book with a note to a former friend, which, if you haven't read that part of the book, again, in terms of even me feeling like reading through that, needing to take a breath and put that down, because I'm sure in so many spaces, many of us have lost friendships or connections over our stance with this. And one thing that you say is, even though you disagree with me, I have an obligation to you. So can you speak about, you don't have to, I'm not asking you to name names or anything, but just, one strength of this book is you're helping us navigate these difficult conversations with love and with obligation. So can you talk about that? Was that the catalyst? Is that falling out with this friend? Is that what made you want to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, it was more than one.
Sure.
There have been a whole number of people, and it's been very difficult. And I've thought a lot about the kind of obligations that I and that have to other Jews that I disagree with, and it really made me reflect back, as I write in the book, on some of the experiences that I had as a kid that led me to have this view of Jews as a kind of an imagined family, the sense that the way in which, and I quote a line from Talmud about the idea that essentially no Jew is without relatives. But I think I just absorbed that as a kid, noticing that, most of my family was in South Africa. And I always noticed that when my grandparents would come to the United States, they would be in a Jewish area in an American city like Boston where they really didn't. I mean, they didn't know their way around the city, or they didn't know the names of the suburbs they were in. Right? They had no frame of reference, but when they saw that these were Jews, they felt completely comfortable and at home with these people. And so that's the way I was raised, and whether that's partly the inheritance of Jewish texts, and it's also the way in which experiences of persecution and trauma kind of fuse people together. To me, there's something very precious about that. I've tried, my own way to raise my kids in that way, to say that you are that you have an obligation as the inheritor of this tradition. People sometimes quote the line "Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Bazeh," all Jews are responsible for one another, and I believe that. But to me, I guess I also believe that part of expressing that responsibility is speaking painful truths when I feel like we are doing things that really violate what I consider to be our best traditions, and I think also put us at risk. And so those are some of the things that I was trying to say to these friends. And I don't know, my greatest hope for the book is that somehow it'll create opportunities for people to have conversations across these lines in a way that might help some people understand why those Jews who, like me, are so distraught about what Israel has done, to help make us more explicable to the people that we love.
In that chapter, you say, well, or someone may ask you, why you titled this book "Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza" and not "Being Jewish After October 7th." Why did you make that choice?
Well, I think that we as a community are grappling with constantly, every single day since October 7th, grapple with the horror of that day, as we should. It was a horrifying day. It was one of the worst days of my life. I talk in the book, I kind of describe a number of stories of different families in southern Israel, what they went through, but also the way in which it rippled through Israeli society. And so we should be grappling with that. I am surrounded when I go to shul with people who are wearing dog tags. We pray for the hostages every day. They are on our refrigerator door in our apartment. So I think that we understand and we live with and we remind ourselves constantly of the human toll of that day. But to me, what struck me again and again was the way in which the human toll in Gaza, which very quickly eclipsed the human toll in Israel on October 7th, was just erased in so many ways. Oftentimes, when you were in Jewish spaces, many of you may have had the same experience, there was no reference to Palestinians whatsoever. And even if there was, it was never to individual people, never in a way that would humanize them. So much of the work, which I appreciated, which was beautiful in Jewish spaces, was always to give a name to the Israelis who had died or to those who had been taken hostage, and to talk about who they were and what their lives were so that we could feel. And yet, I never heard that vis-a-vis Palestinians. In fact, worse, I generally, if someone brought up the question of what was happening to Palestinians, you get these series of talking points, which basically boil down to, first of all, it's really probably not as bad as people say, because they're lying, right? The Hamas health ministry can't be trusted. Lo and behold, it turns out that the quote-unquote Hamas health ministry's numbers were completely off, right? They're far too low, right? It didn't take a rocket scientist to see that the numbers would be way low because they were only counting people whose bodies could get to morgues. And anyone who could see an image of Gaza could see how many people's bodies were never going to even make it to the morgues because they were under rubble, or people were going to be dying in their homes because of lack of medical care or because of lack of food. What so upset me was that I felt like I was constantly confronted with smart people who in so many parts of their lives were smart and thoughtful and empathetic and decent. And on this question, it was like a wall just came down. And I started to hear these talking points, and I was thinking, like, these are not even arguments. Like, have you ever looked into the international law about human shields? Do you really believe that international law suggests that because you think there are a couple of fighters there, you can take down a hospital or an apartment building? Because if that's the way international law worked, what about all the apartment buildings in Tel Aviv where Israeli generals live, right? What about the fact that the Kiryat, Israel's defense ministry, is located in downtown Tel Aviv, surrounded by schools, right? It's nonsense to say that you don't have to care about civilians because you think there are fighters there. And yet I just heard, and it was like there was this. These felt to me like defense mechanisms, like things people said so they didn't have to feel anything. And that's what I felt like I was trying to penetrate in the book.
Yeah, you have a line that says, these are the stories people tell themselves to block out the screams from Gaza. And to not only watch the destruction, but to maybe shrug and say, either this is necessary or it's not that bad.
Right.
You know, one thing I'm curious about, and one thing you do very well in this book, again, in such a short book, you do very well in terms of the stories, again, that people tell themselves. Mm-hmm. It's not just the political stories, it's not just the statistics, but you do talk about the traditional stories, mm-hmm. perhaps that Jewish people are telling themselves, whether it's Passover or Purim. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about the different sorts of stories that you basically are having to challenge on multiple levels?
Yeah, I mean, the point I tried to make is that I think the way Jewish holidays are often narrated in kind of popular American Jewish discourse is these narratives of victimhood and survival. You know, this joke, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? That's the story, right? So that's Purim, that's Passover, that's Hanukkah. And the point I try to make in the book is actually the stories are much more complicated than that, right? The stories in our sacred texts in general depict Jews, and sometimes it's maybe anachronistic to use the word Jews, maybe they're Israelites, but they depict these people in the full range of different human capacities, right? As victims, as victimizers. Doesn't mean our texts always condemn these terrible acts. Oftentimes, there's a whole debate in rabbinic commentary about how to understand these things. But what our tradition doesn't do is pretend that they don't exist, right? Which is what I think very often happens in American Jewish discourse. So I'm often just struck when people talk about Purim in kind of mainstream American Jewish discourse, that the ninth chapter of the book of Esther, the end of the story is as if it didn't happen, right? Because it's not just that Mordecai and Esther save the Jews of Persia from destruction, right? After the king turns his signet ring, there's a shift in power, right? Things are turned upside down, right? The whole motif of Purim, things are turned upside down, right? And the people who end up suffering this massacre are the enemies of the Jews, right? 75,000 people, right? And that's actually part of what we're celebrating here, right? And so, on the far right in Israel, and even sometimes the United States, there is a celebration of this, right? But I think in the kind of Jewish center and mainstream spaces, it's ignored. And so, to me, there is a connection between the fact that we ignore the end of the book of Esther, that we stop the Hanukkah story when the Maccabees rededicate the temple and regain Jewish sovereignty, and don't ask, what did the Maccabees do in power when they became the Hasmonean dynasty, even though our own religious tradition, the Talmud didn't like, one of the reasons the Talmud doesn't have that much to say about Hanukkah was that the rabbis of the Talmud had such a negative view of what the Maccabees had become once they took power and abused that power in various ways. And so, but we, I think, edit out these things, and I think my argument is there's a connection between what we don't face in these sacred texts and what we're not willing to face in Gaza, which is also a story of the Jewish capacity to do harm to other people, because we're just a group of human beings. There's nothing about our history, about anything about us, that means that we don't have the same capacity to do the same things as any other group of people. And it's only the awareness that you do have the capacity, right, that allows you to start to build in the kind of discourse that might actually prevent you from doing the worst things.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna let y'all clap whenever y'all want to, because I don't even have to do much. Yeah, I think for someone who I grew up evangelical in Texas, so a lot of these stories are perhaps familiar, but maybe parallel tracks. And I think it's actually extremely profound that you and I are both journalists at esteemed legacy institutions, but I think very often we tend to leave out or ignore or elide over the stories that are being told in our churches, in our synagogues, in our community life across the table. And those stories are extremely difficult to undo,
Yeah.
Right? So I'm also kind of wondering, even as how you see the kind of interplay of these sort of sacred texts into the justifications, perhaps, for what's been happening in Gaza.
Right. So one of the first things that was said after October 7th was that Hamas, and sometimes not just Hamas, sometimes the Palestinians in general, were Amalek, right? This figure, which first shows up in the book of Exodus, that is considered this kind of embodiment of pure evil that must be destroyed, right? It was really striking to me in which, from the moment that October 7th happened, the way in which it was interpreted as essentially was this the reincarnation of the monsters from Jewish sacred texts, but also the monsters from secular history, the Nazis, right? It was continually described as the largest murder of Jews since the Nazis, right? Or it was described as a pogrom, right? Which is essentially, I think, the message here is that what's the conditions in which this violence are occurring are essentially the same conditions that existed in Nazi Germany or existed in the Russian Empire, or they existed with Amalek. And that, the whole point of Amalek, right, in some ways is that its murderous, its tendency to, its attack on the Jews is entirely irrational, right? It's simply the product of some kind of innate evil that exists, and it becomes the kind of the embodiment of the innate evil that exists in the human condition, right? And similarly, when you call people Nazis, essentially what you're saying is they kill Jews because that's simply their value system, right? That's their ideology, right? And to me, this was, in some ways, this discourse was then facilitated, right? The destruction of Gaza, which now I think more and more international legal scholars have said constitutes a genocide under international law, right? Because the message is basically, you don't need to understand anything about what conditions were like in Gaza on October 6th, or for in Gaza or for Palestinians in general, right? Because this is just an expression of pure evil, right? And it's so difficult in Jewish and American discourse, right, to have any conversation about the conditions that existed in Gaza on October 6th without immediately being accused of justifying, right? But to me, the distinction between justifying and understanding is fundamental if you're ever actually going to try to make people safer, right? I mean, morally, yes, I think that October 7th was a horrifying war crime. I'm fundamentally opposed to any targeting of civilians, for no matter the justification, under any circumstance, right? And so I'm glad that the Hamas leaders also potentially face prosecution at the International Criminal Court for what was done on October 7th, right? But just as the United States after 9/11, right, couldn't respond effectively to 9/11, right, unless it tried to make an accurate assessment of understanding what was happening, right? I think similarly, the assessment that became the mainstream assessment was essentially a story that Hamas in particular and Palestinians in general are basically just barbarians who kill Jews for no reason whatsoever, right? And then then of course that's what lays the foundation for the destruction of Gaza. Whereas the argument that I try to make in the book is that it makes more sense to understand what happened on October 7th as in a tradition of inhumane, right, and pitiless violence by people who are suffering structural oppression. And there are many, many, many examples of that, right? I mean, it's, to me, one of the things that I find striking is the way in which America's own amnesia about our history in the 19th century prevents us from understanding certain things, right? So, in the 19th century, what happened on October 7th and the force like Hamas would have been, I think, in some ways much more would have been something that Americans would have understood much more easily, right? Because there was a native population. They had been forced off their land into smaller and smaller enclaves, right? And so one of the fundamental things one needs to know about Gaza is the people of Gaza mostly are not from Gaza, right? They're from families that were expelled from what's now Israel. Many of them can even see the lands from which they were expelled. They're forced into this area half the size of New York, which the UN said was unlivable even before October 7th, right? And so what happened in the 19th century in the West, in the Midwest in the 19th century, when Native Americans broke out of these reservations they had been forced into, oftentimes they killed men, women, and children in terrible, brutal attacks, right? And of course, the response from Americans was, well, these are just savages, and so therefore we have to hit them even harder, right? And I think that if we could understand that, our own history, right, from the 19th century, we could then have a context to understanding what happened here. Again, not to justify it, but to say the way to make Israeli Jews safer, right, is to tackle the core fundamental underlying grievance of a people that is denied basic freedom and to recognize the violence that they are subjected to through a system of oppression.
You hit on sort of two questions I wanted to ask pretty well, which is there, yes, something very sort of inherent and specific to the American discourse, which you've already alluded to, which is this history of extermination, settler colonialism, and all of that. And I was curious if you've seen or noticed discourse in other places where there are significant Jewish populations that don't have that same kind of mental block, roadblocks.
Unfortunately, not that much, to be honest. I think in a very strange way, actually, the United States, and I'm sure for those folks who have spent part of their lives in other diaspora Jewish communities, they will know that actually America is actually the Jewish community in the world in which is most tolerant of dissent, actually. It's a lot easier to be a Jew who's critical of Israel in the United States than it is in Australia, in Canada, in France, in Britain.
Why do you think that is?
I think that those, it's partly because of the structure of those communities. Because there are a lot of American Jews, and because American Jews are quite assimilated, there's not really a core to the American Jewish community in the same way, which is to say you can find institutions that you can build your own institutions even if they are somewhat dissenting. Whereas in those smaller communities, which also tend to be more religiously traditional, there really is something called the Jewish community, right? And you're kind of either in it or you're out of it, right? Whereas here, I think it's a little bit more fluid. There are kind of more gradations, especially if you're not in the Orthodox community. Yeah. But part of what I find so troubling, as I argue in the book, is that what's happened because the leadership of so many of these Jewish communities around the world think about their political orientation in terms of defending Israel, right, is that actually makes it very difficult for them to defend liberal democracy in their own countries, because the people in their countries who often are the most fervently supportive of Israel are ethno-nationalists who admire Israel because they see it as a kind of model for the country that they want to build, right? A country with clear legal hierarchies based on ethnicity or religion or race, countries with an immigration policy that says only people from the dominant tribe are allowed to immigrate here. And so you essentially ally yourself, right, or at least tolerate people from those ethno-nationalists because they're reliable friends of Israel, even as they are destroying the liberal democracy that has made Jews safe in those countries. You know, I mean, when I think about the organized American Jewish community today, in this moment of astonishing threat to American liberal democracy, we are a community that is unusually politically articulate. We have built institutions that have a lot of political muscle, right? What does it say about us that our most powerful institution that American Jewry has created, AIPAC, right, cannot fight to preserve American liberal democracy, right? Because it actually takes no position on what happens in the United States at all. It's actually fundamentally, as a matter of first principle, indifferent to what happens in our country, right? The only metric that it uses to evaluate politicians is, do they unconditionally support Israel? And you know, if that's your only metric, you're going to actually find that Donald Trump and all of his people are actually are people you're much more likely to support, right, than people on the left who actually believe in the principle of equality under the law, which means you become complicit in the destruction of American liberal democracy, even though it's liberal democracy and equality that keeps us safe, right? And that's what I find really frightening.
And this is a perfect segue into even, to an extent, my experience in the last 2 years in deciding to opine on what I guess believe have been atrocities and genocide in Gaza. I was not prepared for the backlash. And I remember there was one friend, if the friend is listening, hello friend, that said when I tweeted or something, Israel shouldn't be allowed to commit atrocities, and all of a sudden an explosion of, I can't believe this anti-Semitism on the left. And I was like, whoa. First of all, I left, where does that even come from? And second of all, and you do discuss this in your book, one thing that has, and you have a whole section on it, one thing that has exploded in terms of the stories that are being told now, which is not new, but it's about this story about an explosion of anti-Semitism on the left.
Right.
And you go into this history of how, particularly actually, there's a tie to Black critique.
Yes, absolutely.
Black critique of the state of Israel's actions.
Right.
So it does seem like some things are bubbling up again. Can you speak a bit more about that? And then I have things to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, what happened in the 1970s was that American Jewish organizations redefined their mission to be groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and then this is the period where AIPAC is becoming a prominent institution. Essentially, redefine their mission from fighting anti-Semitism against individual Jewish people to fighting to defending a state, right? And so a definition of anti-Semitism emerges in the 1970s, sometimes called the new anti-Semitism, which essentially says the anti-Semitism that we're really now worried about is anti-Semitism that manifests itself as opposition to the state of Israel. Sometimes people would use this phrase, Israel is the Jew of the nations, right? But the problem is when you define a struggle against bigotry as the protection of a particular state, right? It does a lot of very strange things, right, to your understanding of what bigotry is, right? I sometimes imagine, like, what if the NAACP saw as central to its mission the defense of the governments of Nigeria, Kenya,
Liberia.
Zimbabwe, Somalia?
There's a history there.
Right, I'd like to know more.
Yeah, which is something that we should actually be talking about more in terms of frame. But yes,
yes.
Right.
My guess would be that they might find a whole group of people who they started to call anti-Black racists, right, who would probably disproportionately be on the left because they were human rights oriented, right, who they would now see as racist under this definition. And this is kind of what's happened with anti-Semitism, right? And so the idea is there's an explosion of anti-Semitism on the left because there's an explosion of criticism and what they would call delegitimization of Israel, questioning of the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, right? And so it's true, if you define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, like the Anti-Defamation League does, you are going to see a lot more anti-Semitism on the left. You're actually going to see a shocking degree of anti-Semitism among Jews themselves, right? Because we see polls that show that like 40% of American Jews under the age of 40 consider Israel an apartheid state. So we must have been doing something really wrong if we're producing so much anti-Semitism even from within our own ranks as a community, right? But I think there's something so perverse about this, right? I mean, if you oppose the existence of Israel as a Jewish state because you want you expel the Jews, kill the Jews, create an Islamic state in which they're subjugated, yes, I think that could constitute anti-Semitism. But if you oppose the existence of Israel as a state based on Jewish legal supremacy because you believe in the principle of equality under the law, right? And for the same reason that you would oppose America becoming a white Christian state, or Hungary as a white Christian state, or France as a white Christian state, this is not bigotry. This is actually the opposite of bigotry, right? Bigotry is the denial of human equality. So if you are fighting for human equality, right, that's not bigotry. It's opposite, right? And if you are defending a system of Jewish supremacy, a system, that's, by the way, the term that B'Tselem, Israel's most prominent human rights organization, uses. If you're defending a system of Jewish supremacy, you're not fighting bigotry, right? You are actually defending bigotry. And so this, to me, is how the whole debate about anti-Semitism has become so perverted. If you look at scholars who study anti-Semitism, I particularly mentioned the work of Eitan Hirsch at Harvard and Laura Roden Eitan Hirsch at Tufts and Laura Roden at Harvard. What you actually find is that it's not true that anti-Semitism defined the way it used to be defined as hostility to Jews as Jews is equal on the right and the left. You find it's much higher on the right, and you also find that the same people who tend to have negative views about Jews tend to have negative views about Muslims and about immigrants and about black people and about LGBT people, right? That these things tend to travel together, and that these people have a hierarchical view of society. They look back to an imagined past in which everybody knew their place, and those hierarchies were enforced by law, like they want to make America great again, right? And those are the people who are most likely to hold anti-Semitic views, right? And so there's a poll I cite from the University of Chicago, which noticed that while anti-Zionist views on college campuses were considerably higher than they were among Americans as a whole, actually anti-Semitic views were lower. Right? And I think that's because of the progressivism that exists on these college campuses, right? So I think this is the way, but the discourse of anti-Semitism has been completely perverted by the need to find a way of delegitimizing and censoring people who are critical of Israel or even critical of Zionism because you don't have good arguments, right? The Anti-Defamation League knows that if it's trying to defend the military court system in the West Bank, it's already lost, right? Any discussion of what life is actually like for Palestinians on the ground, you've already lost the conversation. So the move is always to basically turn attention away from what's actually happening to Palestinians on the ground and turn it into a question about the motivations of the person who is making the criticism, right? And so that's essentially the strategy that's always employed. And to me, and I'll stop because I'm going on for so long. To me, it's
making my job easy, man.
It's really, really infuriating and upsetting because I feel like the reason that calling people anti-Semitic tends to shut them up so much, right, is because in the name of anti-Semitism, horrifying things have been done to the Jewish people. So good people don't want to be called anti-Semitic. They fear. The better you are as a person, right, the more you're going to fear this, right? And so there is this kind of moral capital that exists, right? This moral capital was not earned by Jonathan Greenblatt or any of the people who run the American Jewish organizations, right? It's built on the genocide and suffering of Jews in generations past, right? But it is now being used in the kind of in the most promiscuous and unfair way, right, to shut down people of goodwill, right, trading and desecrating this experience of Jewish suffering in order to defend a system of oppression and supremacy, right? And it seems to me that's a desecration of Jewish history, in my view.
There's so many more questions, but so little time. But I mean, one thing I wanted to again applaud you for in this book is that you do bring an international and a comparative framework to Israel. There's especially growing up in South Africa or spending a part of your childhood in South Africa. At the end of the book, you actually feel like both as a framework for how to sort of de-exceptionalize
exactly.
Israel. I appreciate someone who writes a lot about Africa and feels like Africa should be much more injected into the national conversations about how to think about this world. I appreciate that you've done that. And not only that, but talking about the fear of the other, right? The fear of the other, whether it was South Africa and the arguments that white South Afrikaners were making against why Black South Africans should have power. I actually, so when you and me were at Columbia, I talked to some folks who could not understand. This was while the encampments were going on, while the protests were going on at Columbia. And they said they couldn't understand why the students were protesting, right? But then yet they also, these are Jewish folks, they were like, but then they also said, but we marched against apartheid in South Africa in the 80s.
Right.
And I could never understand or square how that reference didn't come into the stories. You've been able to fully really do it very well, do it justice. So can you talk more about that? In some ways, I feel like you're a bit of a special unicorn in the sense that you have had that experience viscerally living in apartheid South Africa and seeing those arguments being mapped on. So how does that?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm actually grateful I have some of my South African relatives here, actually. I think that the point that I wanted to try to make is that this equation of legal supremacy with safety and the assumption that an end to that supremacy would lead to certain death, that maybe Jews think that just comes out of our own history of trauma, and maybe that does inform it. But I actually think it's very typical of people who become accustomed to legal supremacy to think that the end of that supremacy would mean that they become the group that's oppressed or even killed, and that this was. And then again, as a child, when I was in South Africa as a kid, it was considered so obvious that by people in my own family that that apartheid was understood as a kind of brutal system, but it was also the system that protected white people against the forces that were against the African National Congress, right, which was considered, again, these movements are sanitized in retrospect, right? The ANC was not a nonviolent organization, right? It was practicing armed resistance. It was getting its arms from the Soviet Union, which was not considered a benign actor, right? The PAC, the ANC smaller, the other Black liberation movement often used the slogan "One settler, one bullet," which was pretty frightening to people. And so people, and the ANC was considered a terrorist organization by the United States. So people reasoned, okay, if this system of supremacy is not here, we will be at the mercy of these folks, right? They couldn't imagine that Black South Africans and the ANC might act differently, right, if they were treated differently. It was like a kind of failure to recognize the kind of cause and effect, right? And that's what I notice often so much about Jewish discourse about Palestinians. It's like, if you give Palestinians any more opportunity, they will just do October 7th again and again and again in perpetuity because that's what Amalek does, right? Rather than recognizing that, I mean, it's almost a childlike point, but that people, the way people interact with you is influenced by how you interact with them, right? And that, so in Conte-Wesizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the ANC's military wing, disbanded when Black South Africans got the vote, right? For a reason that shouldn't be that hard for us to understand, right? Which was that when Black people had the opportunity to influence government and to try to get their needs met politically in a way that didn't risk their lives, right? That was considered vastly preferable for the vast majority of Black South Africans, right? And similarly, in Northern Ireland, I quote Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader, who called the Good Friday Agreement, which gave Catholics political equality, he called it a prelude to genocide. One of the things that was really a revelation for me, actually, in researching the book, was to realize how much Protestant discourse in Northern Ireland described Catholic Ireland in ways that are so similar to the way that I remember white South Africans describing Africa, right? And the way that so many Jews describe the Middle East, right, as a barbaric, backward place, right?
Tom Friedman, an animal kingdom, a jungle.
Yeah, I mean, and again, if you're in that place at that time, it has a superficial plausibility. So Jews or Israelis will say, look, there are no liberal democracies in the Middle East, right? Just like my relatives would say, look at these African countries. They're dictatorships. They're in civil wars. They're baskets. You want that here, right? And his thing is, they weren't wrong that they were dictatorships, that they were dysfunctional governments, that they were governments that were doing terrible things, but they were ascribing it even to a kind of racial essentialism, right? Whereas I almost never hear, I always hear Israeli and other American Jews basically saying something along the lines of, Peter, your views might be nice in a utopian world. Maybe they could work in Denmark, but we live in the Middle East, right? It's funny, I've never heard a Palestinian say that. I've never heard a Palestinian say that. And it's not because they think the government of Egypt and Saudi Arabia are benign, but because they understand that to understand the dictatorships of those governments, you have to understand the political context, the colonial context, the Cold War context, right? That these are politically determined. They're not simply because that's the way Arabs are. Right. That's the way Muslims are. And it's that racist discourse that I think is part of what makes it so hard for us to imagine that equality actually could make us safe.
All right. And on that note, I will, and I hope we have some time for questions. Your ending really, again, hit me in the soul and the gut with so much going on. Here, politically, domestically, we have a segregationist regime, which I will say in power right now. You say, maybe this sounds grandiose, but I don't think our transformation as Jews is necessary only for Israel and Palestine. It's necessary for the world. And then you say in your last graph, speaking of Abraham's descendants in the book of Genesis, God says, all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And you say, perhaps this is what it means for the Jewish people to bless humanity in our time. It means liberating ourselves from supremacy. So, as partners with Palestinians, we can help liberate the world. I thought that was beautiful. Thank you for saying that.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we have some time for questions. Please come up to this mic right here. We've already got a queue. Please, a question. I think we have 20. Where are my handlers? How much time?
Up there.
We have 15 minutes. Say the handlers. Okay.
I've been a fan since I read your piece in the New York Review of Books, I think.
Thank you.
And I watch you every Friday until you switch to 1 o'clock when I can't watch anymore.
Sorry about that.
I'm very old. I was born between the end of the Holocaust and the formation of Israel, 1947. And what we thought then, Israel was as important as Torah, maybe more so, because of what was coming out of Europe. The story of Hillel, who teaches the man the Torah while standing on one foot.
Right.
Question. Yes. What is your question? Sorry.
The question is,
thank y'all.
He said that
what is hateful unto you? Yeah.
We should not treat other people.
Right.
We have to treat other people the way we
Yes.
want to be treated ourselves.
Right. Yes.
And we all thought that.
Right.
And I can't understand what's going on in Israel and the Israelis.
Yeah.
Right.
Why don't they believe in that?
Okay.
We did.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a good question.
That's the question.
Yes.
Thank you. I really
maybe
appreciate
what
it.
we'll do,
I
what we'll
appreciate
do
it.
is take 2 or 3
Thank you.
rapid fire questions at a time. And then Peter, you can have a grab
Sure.
bag.
Sure.
So introduce yourself and go ahead. Yeah.
So I've seen you give just kind of recent interviews.
Yeah.
And I think you've said that at this point you don't think a 2-state solution is possible anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you think some sort of binational state
Yes.
should happen.
Yes.
I guess could you give any thoughts you have on like the process, like
Sure.
with the like how that could unfold?
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Let's take 2 more. So Israel and then 2-state solution. Yes.
I have a question about sort of voice versus exit. So you've decided, I think, to remain, very active in the community and to sort of speak out, which is beyond sort of courageous. But is there a point where the atrocities that the Zionist movement commits become so grotesque and our community becomes so enthusiastically identified with them that the only moral choice is to just disassociate?
Thanks.
Take one more question.
You might have to help me remember these.
Yeah, I'm taking mental notes. All good.
what America does really affects the war in Israel. When do you think, or do you think, that American Jews should call for our government not to send arms to Israel?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, great question. All right, so you have the calls for ending weapons transfers, voice versus exit. You still are deciding to remain in the Jewish community?
Yeah.
Two-state solution.
I think I'm going to answer them, and then we're going to go to the
Yes,
next group.
exactly.
So just hold on one
Yeah,
second.
Let's hold for a second.
Just hold on 1 second if you don't mind, and you'll be the next one.
Rapid
The next
fire
one.
batch. Go ahead.
Okay, so I guess on the question of arms, I think the first step would simply to be say that the United States should enforce its own laws, right? So the Leahy Law says the United States is not allowed to provide weapons to the unit of any foreign security force that we find to be committing gross human rights
We
violations.
actually have enforced, by the way, in Nigeria, in
Right.
the fight against Boko Haram, which I reported on.
Right.
So
This
it's not
is
that they cannot enforce
right.
them.
I mean, this is the irony, right, of like this double standards argument, right? You know, which is also in the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, right? That there is a double standard, right? The double standard is that rules that are applied to countries in Africa or countries in Latin America are not applied to Israel. In fact, we don't even track, we don't even do we don't even collect the data that would allow us to do that, right? And so I think that would be the first, it would be a revolution if you imposed the Leahy Law on Israel. On the question of exit, I would say I don't think the choice is between being in the community or exiting, because I think that first of all, if you reject Judaism, Jewish texts, Jewish law, Jewish practice, because you're alienated by Israel, in some ways, I think you have let people who define Israel as Judaism win, right? I mean, the point is that it is actually, as argument, to elevate a state above Torah is idolatry, right? And so I think the right thing to do is to try to create Jewish spaces, right, that are built on Torah, built on prayer, not built on ethno-nationalism. And I think out of this horror, one of the things that is happening, actually, and I see it in New York, is there is actually a tremendous amount of ferment that is happening. There's tremendous amount of so much energy and talent, especially among young people, who want to create the kind of institutions that were not there for them when they were growing up. I know a number of minyanim that have emerged in New York just in the last year or two that are non or anti-Zionist. And I think that there's a lot to take part in, actually, that's going to change I think that will be something that historians of American Jewry write about. They will write about this moment generations from now because of what's happening in terms of religious revival. On the question of, what was the second? There was a question about the...
Two states. I mean...
Oh, 2 states. Oh, yeah, that's a big... I mean...
Can you do that in 30 seconds?
Look, part of I should say is that part of the difficulty engaging this question is that we don't know what the Palestinian national movement is asking for, right? The Palestinian PLO made this historic decision in 1988 to abandon what they had called the secular democratic Palestine, which is basically one equal state, although not necessarily binational, to accept partition. But now, because we don't have functioning Palestinian political institutions, because Israel and the United States won't really allow Palestinians to vote, and because the PLO is kind of a dead letter, we don't know what Palestinians as the group that are being denied rights, in what way they would want to vindicate those rights, right? But it seems to me that, yes, I don't think that partition is remotely possible anymore. I mean, in 1982, Anthony Lewis wrote a column in the New York Times entitled 5 Minutes to Midnight about the impending death of the two-state solution, when there were 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, right? Now you're talking about 700,000 or so if you include East Jerusalem, but that isn't even, that doesn't even get at the kind of massive infrastructure that existed, right? And so I think that, I think if Palestinians and Israeli Jews through a legitimate process accepted partition, that would be fine. But I also think one equal state is more just, because I think in the notion of two states as commonly imagined, Palestinian refugees don't have the right to return because that would undermine Israel's Jewish majority, right? I don't like the language of demographic majorities, right? This is Tucker Carlson's language, right? And I don't understand how one can ethically argue, right, that Jews like me, whose families may not have lived in this part of the world for 2,000 years, should have the right to return to those places if a Palestinian whose family was expelled 75 years ago can't, right? I mean, so one equal state allows Palestinian right of return, which I think is really important.
All right, let's take a few more. Sorry?
I read your book.
Did you want to address the loud?
I would just say on the point of don't do to others what is hateful, what you consider to be hateful. One of the things that you see again and again and again in Torah is the linking of this principle to the Jewish experience of bondage, the Israelite experience of bondage in Egypt, right? That you remember the stranger, don't mistreat the stranger. All of the Jewish laws about how to deal with strangers, with slaves, are all based on the experience of Jews in slavery. And so again, I think this is at the core. Rashi says that 36 times in the Torah it says that you should remember the heart of the stranger. So this is very, very fundamental, I think, to Judaism.
All right, let's take another batch of a couple questions.
Yeah, I read your book before October 7th and after, and of course there's a major, major shift. But as a long shot as two-state solution may be now, I think your other solution, which is understandable but so idealistic it has no chance of succeeding in that part of the world.
Yeah.
The Arab countries will not be supportive, and the U.S. is, God knows where they'll be.
Yeah, so
at this
what's your
point.
question?
Yeah.
You're saying
it's not
The
realistic.
question is, what brought about the major shift besides the obvious humanitarian situation and the overreaction by Israel?
Thank you.
All right, let's take maybe two more.
Hi. So we know there's quite a network of organizations and quite a number of people in Israel who are working for peace and are respectful of Palestinians and want their history to be recognized. Where do they fit in? Because I heard you talk a lot about the Israelis who don't want to look at Palestinians as people. There's a lot of people there who do.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's a good
No,
question.
I
Maybe
think
let's
that.
take one
Oh
more.
yeah. Great point. Wildly unrealistic. What is realistic is what is realistic is this system of domination that exists now and even moves towards mass expulsion, right? But to me, the question, when we think about what future could we bring about, to me, the critical question is what kind of movement can be created that can become powerful enough that it can be strong enough to bring down these very powerful systems of oppression in the way that the anti-apartheid movement did, in the way that the civil rights movement did, movements that were able to make the unthinkable possible. And to me, that movement is likely to be much more powerful if it's built on the same principle as those previous movements, the principle of human freedom and human equality, than the principle of partition into two ethno-nationalist states. What was the other question? Do you remember?
My brain got a little.
Yeah, I don't remember what the other question. Sorry.
Peace movement.
Oh, yeah. I'm really glad you asked that. Yes,
Yeah.
they're right. I certainly did not mean to suggest that there are not Jewish Israelis who are doing extraordinary things, and often doing so under tremendous difficulty. So, for instance, there's the group Zochrot, for instance, which tries to bring to Israeli Jews awareness of the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948, which is an extremely difficult thing, right? Or a group like Standing Together that brings together Palestinians and Israeli Jews in support of the principle of equality. I think, unfortunately, those groups are on the political margins in Israel. They don't have strong political representation. I wish that the people that we talk about as being the Israeli Jewish center also believed in these principles of human equality and equality under the law. Unfortunately, people who we tend to call centrists in Israel, like Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz, actually have embraced Trump's mass expulsion plan, right? So I think it's important to distinguish between them, right, and those Israelis, including Jewish Israelis, who actually really are fighting for the principle of equality under the law.
All right, you're the last one. You're the last one. No pressure.
I hope it's gonna end things on a relatively uplifting note.
Oh.
I hope it's going to end things on a relatively uplifting note. I'm a new parent, and I was wondering what advice you have for parents who have unlearned Zionism, seeking to raise Jewish children today. And do you think discussion of Palestine solidarity needs to have a place within young Jewish education in the U.S.?
Thank you.
Beautiful question.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate the question. I think that part of the reason that this ethno-nationalist project has been kind of put right in the center of Jewish life, so that in so many Jewish institutions, your fidelity to that is considered to be more important than whether you keep Shabbat or whether you keep kosher or whether you study Torah, right? The most important thing is whether you unconditionally support Israel, is because of the vacuum that has existed in American Jewish communities in which we haven't taken Jewish education seriously, and we haven't really answered, I think, the fundamental question of what does our tradition have to teach young people about how to live, about how to face the questions that they are going to encounter in their lives. So I do think that, of course, that young people, in age-appropriate ways should be taught the truth about Israel and Palestine, and they should encounter Palestinian texts. They should encounter Palestinians. That we would live in a very different world if your average synagogue and Jewish school and Jewish camp had done that. But I also think one has to try to answer the question, what does this tradition offer you as a way to live? And that question really has nothing to do with Israel and Palestine per se, right? It has to do with like a deep engagement of Jewish texts and an experience of joy in Jewish practice. And I think that is so often where our community has failed. And that's why so many rabbis speak about Israel, on Shabbat, because they haven't actually found a way of making Jewish texts, which are some of the most foundational stories in human history, right? The book of Genesis is not a boring book, right? It's done pretty well. And yet, what does it say about our community that in so many places the rabbi feels like if he talks about the Parsha, that will be considered too boring, right? So he needs to talk about the latest commentary on Israel from the New York Times, right? So I think that's the work that people like you can do.
Amazing. And on that note, literally for the future generation, Peter, thank you. This is amazing.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for coming. Politics and Prose, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Go out and buy the book.
Yep.
Bookstore